Everybody. We only have a few months or a few days left in Pride Month, so I'm going to try to get through as much material as I can for my book, Blame It on Dress, the Manufacturing of Black Homophobia and Performative Masculinity. And so the last time I went through chapter 4 of my book, which addresses how, the absentee Black fathers have a negative impact on their sons. And so, to be fair, now I'm going to talk about the mother's role because people have said that I don't know, I'm choosing one side or the other. It's like, no, I'm actually critiquing the entire community. If you read the book, it's actually very comprehensive. So, just so I don't waste time, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Let me get to chapter 3. And hopefully, I'll be able to do two more chapters before the end of July. I don't know. As time permits, hopefully, I'll be able to share some more information about from this book. This was my first book, by the way. So, chapter 3, The Mother's Wound, How Black Mothers Break Their Sons. A young Black boy no older than 3 flinches as his mother raises a belt above her head. His only crime, his only crime, crying too long, moving too delicately, speaking too gently. The belt comes down, and with it, his first lesson. Any display of femininity is a punishable offense. If he cries, she'll yell, "Stop crying before I give you something to cry about." If he doesn't cry, she'll yell, "Oh, you ain't gonna cry? You ain't gonna cry?" Before bringing the belt down again, making sure he does. And when it's over, she'll say the classic line, "Fix your face." This is a total domination in which the child has no rights and doesn't even have autonomy over his own facial expressions. Even in pain, he is expected to prioritize his mother's feelings, ensuring that she doesn't have to face any discomfort from her. She doesn't have to face any discomfort after abusing her children. The message that this sends is, I don't matter and everyone else comes first. Over time, this profoundly damages the child's self esteem, teaching him that his feelings are insignificant and his worth is tied to others' needs and expectations. It teaches him to be a docile people pleaser. Developmental research demonstrates that mothers have the most profound impact on early childhood development, their influence far exceeding that of fathers during critical formative periods. For Black boys, this maternal primacy often becomes their first experience of systemic violence, while external institutions may later inflict harm. It is typically the mother who delivers the first devastating message. Any perceived weakness is dangerous and must be eliminated through force. The statistics are clear. Mothers spend significantly more time in direct caregiving than fathers, particularly in Black families where systemic inequalities have led to higher rates of single motherhood. This increased maternal presence means that mothers become the primary architects of their sons' emotional and psychological development. When these mothers, often carrying their own unhealed trauma, respond to perceived femininity with violence, they create wounds more profound than any external system could inflict. Black mothers, burdened by stress, systemic oppression, and generational trauma, frequently shape their sons through violence rather than nurturing. The beatings begin in early childhood development, not for defiance, but for perceived femininity. While they claim this violence is necessary for survival, research indicates that maternal abuse during critical developmental periods creates more severe psychological damage than later institutional oppression. The son is completely dehumanized and objectified. His tears don't matter. His fear doesn't matter. He doesn't matter. What matters is that he performs. He is required to stop being soft, or more accurately, feminine. The woman who is supposed to love her son ends up becoming her son's greatest oppressor. This betrayal, occurring during critical periods of attachment formation, shapes him more than any subsequent trauma. The image of the Black mother as the unwavering disciplinarian is so deeply entrenched in a culture that it often goes unquestioned. In many Black households, particularly those led by single mothers, discipline falls squarely on the mother. And that discipline isn't corrective, measured, or instructive, it's abuse. For generations, Black mothers have been positioned as the head of the household, not by choice, but by necessity. Fathers, whether pushed out by systemic racism, incarceration, unresolved trauma, or simply choosing to abandon their families, are too often absent. Left to raise children in a world designed to crush them, Black mothers harden themselves. They mistake control for care and violence for protection. A feminist son feels like a liability, not a blessing. I brought you into this world and I'll take you out of it. Isn't just a saying, it's a declaration of ownership. Passed down like an heirloom, in their attempt to prepare their sons for a cruel world, Black mothers often become the first to oppress their children, reinforcing the chains of a system that commodifies their lives. This cruel paradox means that instead of offering safety, those who should protect their children end up being the ones who enforce the very oppression they fear will harm them, continuing a cycle of trauma disguised as protection. Bringing, excuse me, y'all. Let me make sure. Let me see who's here. Okay. I just want to make sure that I don't have any audio issues. Bringing children to a world is not a justification for abusing them. In fact, it should be a reason to protect and nurture them. When parents abuse their children, they are ultimately abusing themselves. These children did not ask to be born. Life is not a gift, it is an imposition. Procreation is a choice. If parents truly believe this world is so cruel and know they can't protect their children, perhaps they should reconsider imposing life on them in the first place. Instead, they voluntarily choose to procreate and then justify abusing their children by claiming it will prepare them for the lion's den, when in reality, they are the ones who threw them into it. Black mothers often justify physical punishment as preparation for a hostile world, claiming their violence shields their children from greater societal brutality. Yet, research decisively shows that the most severe psychological damage Black boys experience often begins at home, not with external institutions. Studies indicate that children who experience regular physical punishment show 75% higher rates of depression and anxiety disorders, along with increased likelihood of aggressive behavior and difficulty forming secure attachments. The claim that this violence is protective masks a darker truth. Physical punishment typically occurs not from calculated discipline, but during moments of parental rage and loss of control. While parents may retroactively justify their actions as necessary preparation for systemic racism, psychological studies reveal that such violence typically stems from unprocessed trauma and poor emotional regulation in the parents themselves. If these parents truly believe the world is so unforgiving, the ethical question of bringing children into such conditions demands examination. Research shows that children subjected to angry physical discipline demonstrate a decreased ability to regulate their own emotions, express higher rates of post traumatic stress symptoms, and encounter difficulty forming trusting relationships in adulthood. Perhaps most troubling is how this violence becomes normalized through cultural narratives of effective parenting. Yet, longitudinal studies definitively, definitively show that physical punishment, particularly when driven by anger, correlates with negative outcomes across all measures of child development. No environment, however hostile, can justify inflicting such documented harm on children. Research documents a typical escalation pattern in physical punishment, often beginning in early childhood before the development of full cognitive understanding. Ages 2 to 7 marks the first systemic use of physical punishment, which is typically triggered by extended crying episodes, exploratory behavior, and gender expression concerns. Studies show this early exposure to violence significantly impacts emotional development and attachment formation. ages 8 through 9, demonstrates a concerning progression as pain tolerance increases, with physical punishment often escalating in severity. During this parents, I mean, excuse me, during this period, parents transition to more severe punishments, increase the frequency of punishment, and consequently expose children to a higher risk of lasting physical trauma. Research indicates this escalation period correlates with increased rates of post traumatic stress symptoms and behavioral issues, highlighting the profound and potential long lasting psychological impact of such disciplinary approaches. Let me just go back to the last one. Um, this is probably the period where they go from beating you with a belt to beating you with an extension cord. And I've talked about beatings with extension cords many times on this channel. It does penetrate the skin. It does leave permanent marks. I think it's abuse. I mean, there's been cases where judges have found beatings with extension cords to be abuse. But again, the reason they escalate from a belt to an extension cord is because they want to make you cry. If you don't cry from the belt, then they're going to move on to the extension cord. Physical abuse often transitions to psychological manipulation through methods such as gender based shaming, emotional suppression, and masculinity focused coercion. Longitudinal studies show this combination of physical and emotional abuse creates lasting impacts on identity formation and emotional regulation. Research demonstrates that Black boys face disproportionate physical punishment not just for misbehavior, but specifically for perceived violations of gender norms. Studies document increased severity of punishment for behaviors coded as feminine, including emotional expression, physical mannerisms, and choice of activities or interests. I hope y'all know where I'm going with this. Basically, if you're interested in playing with girl toys or feminine activities, you're going to be punished for it. Not as if you actually chose that. This is what you like. You may think that the Barbie is prettier than the G.I. Joe. You're going to get beaten for that. This pattern represents not legitimate discipline, but systemic gender enforcement through violence. Psychological research indicates that boys who display traits society typically associates with femininity, emotional sensitivity, artistic inclination, or gentle demeanor face more frequent and severe punishment than those exhibiting traditionally masculine behaviors, even when those masculine behaviors are destructive. The implicit message transforms parental fear into generational trauma. Your femininity makes me, excuse me, your femininity makes you vulnerable. Your vulnerability terrifies me. I will eliminate it through violence before society can exploit it. Studies show this leads to a complex and deeply damaging psychological outcome where individuals experience suppression of emotional expression, internalize homophobia, and suffer lasting psychological trauma. For many Black mothers, a son displaying femininity feels like a personal failure. It's not just about how the child moves, speaks, or emotes. It's about what those traits say about the mother herself. In a society that already devalues Black motherhood, raising a son who embraces his feminine side is seen as negligence, as though nurturing a child's full humanity means setting him up for failure. Black mothers themselves, raised under patriarchy, have internalized the belief that masculinity equals strength and femininity equals weakness. When a son displays feminine traits, the mother doesn't just see a deviation from societal norms, she sees evidence that she has failed to toughen him up, to equip him for survival in a world that targets Black men. This belief is reinforced by generational trauma and systemic oppression. Many Black mothers were taught by their own parents that nurturing was a luxury they could not afford. Love, they were told, is synonymous with discipline. And so, when their sons express femininity, whether through tears, emotional intelligence, or creativity, mothers respond not with understanding but with violence. The rejection of femininity is not subtle. It is enforced through beatings, mockery, and shame. The household becomes the first site of gender policing long before schools or streets can shape a boy's sense of self. The rejection of femininity is not subtle, but rather enforced through a complex and brutal system of beatings, mockery, and shame. The household becomes the first site of gender policing long before schools or streets can shape a boy's sense of self. A boy might be questioned about his walk, suddenly becoming self-conscious and learning to stiffen his stride to erase the natural sway of his hips. Emotional expressions are systematically crushed with threats like "you better stop crying before I give you something to cry about," transforming his tears, the most human expression of emotional intelligence, from a sign of vulnerability into a potential source of punishment. The word sissy becomes a weapon synonymous with failure, not just for the individual boy, but for the mother herself, who is perceived as having failed to raise a real man if her son displays any traits deemed feminine. Through these mechanisms, femininity is violently policed, teaching boys that softness is a weakness to be eliminated rather than a natural part of human emotional experience. Through these words and the punishment that follow, Black boys internalize a dangerous lesson. Femininity is shameful, and shame invites violence. But what mothers fail to see is that this policing doesn't just strip their sons of femininity, it fractures their entire humanity. A boy cannot grow into a whole man without embracing his feminine aspects of himself. By suppressing those traits, mothers create sons who are emotionally stunted, disconnected from their inner world, and incapable of forming healthy relationships. Black mothers often believe they are protecting their sons by beating femininity out of them. In their minds, the world is cruel, and any sign of vulnerability makes a black boy an easy target. They see their actions as preemptive strikes, pain inflicted at home to spare their sons from worse pain outside. But this logic is flawed. Beating a boy into submission does not prepare him for the world. It conditions him to accept abuse as love. It teaches him that those who care for him will hurt him, that safety is conditional, and that his own femininity is his greatest enemy. What mothers fail to realize is that vulnerability is not liability, it's a strength. Boys who are allowed to express their feminine side grow into men who are emotionally intelligent, compassionate, and self aware. These are the traits that truly equip a man to navigate a hostile world, not the rigid, hollow masculinity beaten into him during childhood. Black mothers claim they are protecting their sons by beating them. In reality, they are breaking their sons before the world even has a chance. To understand why so many black mothers inflict violence on their sons, we must first confront an uncomfortable truth. Many black women are parenting from a place of unhealed trauma. Black motherhood is one of the most emotionally taxing roles in the world. Poverty, abandonment, racism, and misogyny form a suffocating backdrop to child rearing. Many black women carry wounds from their own childhoods, wounds inflicted by absent fathers, overburdened mothers, and a society that devalues their existence. For many, motherhood is both a blessing and a battlefield. A son represents hope, a chance to get it right, to raise a man who will succeed where others have failed. But he also serves as a constant reminder of the mother's own wounds, her unmet needs, and the pain she has carried for years. Many mothers, especially single black mothers, unconsciously project their unresolved trauma onto their sons, using them as vehicles for their own healing. Studies show that some attempt to correct their own childhood hardships through their children, creating a dynamic where the son is burdened with expectations that have little to do with his own identity. Worse, many mothers also take out their anger and resentment toward the child's father on the son himself, punishing him for the man's failures. This cycle forces children into a role they never agreed to play, bearing the weight of their mother's past while struggling to build their own future. Research demonstrates that maternal physical abuse often stems not from disciplinary intent, but from displaced emotional distress. Studies show children frequently become targets for unprocessed parental trauma, particularly in communities facing systemic oppression and economic hardship. Clinical evidence indicates that children in stress households often become involuntary receptacles for parental emotional discharge, with physical punishment directly correlating to maternal stress levels. During periods of economic hardship, violence tends to increase and abuse patterns increasingly mirror the external pressures impacting the family. Psychological research identifies a pattern where physical punishment serves as emotional catharsis for the parent rather than correction for the child. This creates a destructive cycle where violence serves as stress relief, followed by post violence rationalization, temporary remorse without behavioral change, and ultimately repeated escalation. Recent studies in intergenerational trauma suggest that parents often react most violently to traits in their children that mirror their own suppressed characteristics. This phenomenon, termed reflection triggered violence, manifests particularly strongly in mothers who experience similar abuse in their own childhoods. Research shows that without therapeutic intervention, traumatized parents often recreate their own abuse patterns, project unresolved pain onto their children, and perpetuate cycles of violence while claiming protective intent. The myth of tough love promises that harsh physical punishment will mold Black boys into resilient, disciplined men ready to face a hostile world. In reality, these beatings do not forge protectors, leaders, or pillars of strength. Instead, they cultivate deep seated fear. Rather than growing into confident individuals, these boys become men who are terrified of their own emotions, terrified of failure, and even distrustful of those who claim to care for them. This punitive approach does not build genuine strength, it provides survival mechanisms. Black boys raised under the constant threat of violence learn to shrink away, obey without question, and constantly scan their environment for signs of impending harm. They become conditioned to react to every subtle shift in tone or expression, always anticipating the next blow. Research shows this hypervigilance developed in response to maternal violence creates lasting alterations in threat detection and stress response systems. This is not the foundation for a strong, autonomous man. It is the foundation for creating a docile, emasculated man. It is the blueprint for someone who will struggle to assert himself in adulthood, either becoming overly passive or, in a tragic twist, overcompensating by adopting an exaggerated and performative form of masculinity. Studies document how this early conditioning leads to what researchers term compensatory masculinity, a defensive response to childhood trauma that manifests as either excuse me, as extreme passivity or aggressive overcompensation. Compounding this issue is a troubling mindset that has taken root within parts of the Black community, a mindset influenced both by colonial legacies and capitalist values. Under this view, children are treated as property extensions of their parents rather than independent human beings with their own rights. Capitalism has taught some to see their children as assets to be managed, with the defense, those are my kids, used to ward off external correction. This perspective ignores the fundamental truth. Children do not belong to anyone. They are individuals with inherent rights, deserving of love, dignity, and the freedom to grow into their full selves. And embracing this harmful narrative, the community not only dehumanizes its most vulnerable and impressionable members, but also perpetuates a cycle of violence that undermines their potential. True strength and resilience will come only when we reject these destructive ideologies, recognize the full humanity of every child, and nurture them in environments that foster genuine growth free from the damaging legacy of tough love. Jungian psychology identifies the anima as the feminine aspect within male psychology, a crucial component for emotional and psychological wholeness. This concept aligns with contemporary research on gender identity development and emotional intelligence. When this natural aspect of male psychology is violently suppressed, research documents severe psychological consequences. Studies show how studies show that when boys are forced to suppress perceived feminine traits, their emotional development becomes disrupted, leading to difficulties in forming intimate relationships and fostering an internalized conflict about gender. This trauma resulting from this suppression, which Carl Jung referred to as negative anima development, often manifests in clinical research as self-directed hostility, externalized misogyny, compromised emotional regulation, and gender-based aggression. Contemporary psychological studies further confirm that boys who are punished for gender nonconformity frequently develop deep-seated identity conflicts, patterns of emotional avoidance, and hostile attitudes towards femininity in all its forms. A boy raised under unpredictable maternal violence grows into a man who is always on guard. He has been trained to monitor every word, every movement, every facial expression, because in his childhood, the slightest misstep could result in pain. Survival meant reading the room with precision, anticipating shift in mood, and adapting accordingly. Over time, this vigilance becomes second nature, an instinct he cannot turn off. This hypervigilance does not disappear in adulthood. It follows him into his relationships, his career, his friendships. He second guesses himself constantly, always afraid of doing or saying the wrong thing. Trust does not come easily, especially with women, because his earliest understanding of love was entangled with punishment. He struggles to believe that affection can exist without conditions or cruelty. As a result, he becomes emotionally dependent on others, unable to make decisions for himself without seeking validation or permission. Fear of failure and rejection keeps him trapped in cycles of self doubt, always looking to others for guidance instead of trusting his own instincts. And perhaps worst of all, he does not know how to trust himself. His entire childhood was spent being told that his natural inclinations, his emotions, femininity, his expressions were wrong. He learns to suppress them, to distrust his own feelings, to live in a constant state of emotional exile. Having been conditioned to believe his own judgment is flawed, he becomes paralyzed by indecision, relying on others to tell him who he should be, what he should do, and how he should feel. The result is a man who appears outwardly functional but internally fractured, forever seeking external approval because he was never taught that his own voice mattered. When a boy has his femininity beaten out of him, he does not suffer in isolation. He carries that harm into his relationships with women. Having been raised to despise femininity, he grows into a man who struggles to respect it in others. He sees emotional expression as a weakness, which makes him incapable of being a supportive partner. He rejects vulnerability in himself and others, treating any sign of softness as something to be mocked. Over time, he may develop a deep seated anger towards women, particularly black women, because he associates them with his first experiences of betrayal. This is how cycles of harm continue. Black men who were not nurtured as children often fail to nurture others, not because they lacked the capacity for love, but because they were never taught how to express it in healthy ways. Nurturing is not a luxury, it is essential for human development. Children who do not receive consistent love, care, and emotional validation struggle to develop a secure sense of self. Without this foundation, they grow into adults who battle feelings of inadequacy, unworthiness, and emotional detachment. When a boy is deprived of nurturing, he learns to see vulnerability as a weakness and emotional connection as a threat. He grows up believing that love is transactional, that affection must be earned, and that his worth is tied solely to what he can provide rather than who he is. As a result, he struggles to show up for his partners, unable to engage in emotional intimacy that healthy relationships require. He may physically be present for his children, but emotionally he is distant, unable to provide the warmth and reassurance they need to thrive. The damage exceeds beyond the family unit. Without a strong emotional core, he may disengage from his community, avoiding deep connections out of fear of rejection or inadequacy. He moves through life in survival mode, prioritizing self protection over connection. This absence of nurturing ripples outward, reinforcing generational cycles of emotional neglect and detachment. The wounds of one generation are passed to the next, not because they are invisible, but because healing was never modeled. True liberation for Black men and the Black community as a whole requires breaking this cycle. It demands radical redefinition of strength, one that embraces vulnerability, emotional presence, and the transformative power of nurturing. Research in masculine psychology demonstrates how early suppression of emotional expression often leads to compensatory hypermasculine behavior. This performance of exaggerated masculinity manifests not as authentic gender expression, but as a trauma response to childhood gender policing. Clinical studies document specific behavioral patterns in men who experience gender based violence. These patterns include aggressive overcompensation, such as excessive displays of dominance, using violence as proof of masculinity, and a compulsive need to demonstrate power. Another pattern is emotional constriction, where emotional expression is selective and limited to anger, with vulnerability being suppressed and emotional intimacy being rejected. Gender surveillance is also common, with hypervigilance about others' gender expression and hostile responses to male emotional vulnerability. This ultimately leads to the perpetuation of gender based violence. This is not strength, it's a survival mechanism built on fear and insecurity. The tragedy is that these men are not living intentionally, they are merely reacting to stimuli, operating in survival mode. They remain that little boy flinching under his mother's belt, desperately trying to prove he is not weak. But the truth is, his femininity was never a weakness. It was stolen from him before he even had a chance to understand it. As Black boys grow into men, their mothers, who have played central roles in their upbringing, come to expect them to be protectors, first of the family and later of the community. Throughout their childhoods, these mothers enforced harsh discipline, demanding strict obedience and compliance. This was not an act of love, but often a response to maternal rage, fear of losing control, and the overwhelming pressures of raising children in an oppressive world. These mothers, shaped by their own trauma and stress, use strict control to ensure survival in a harsh environment. However, as these boys transition into adulthood, the expectation that they will become strong protective figures is placed on them with the assumption that they are emotionally equipped to fulfill this role. But protection is not just a physical act. True protection requires emotional connection, a deep bond built on trust and mutual respect. Black mothers often fail to recognize that by raising their sons under harsh discipline, they've taught them to detach emotionally rather than connect. This emotional detachment, cultivated through years of suppression and abuse, is not a natural state, but one conditioned by an environment where vulnerability was seen as weakness. Protection, when rooted in love and emotional investment, comes from a place of care and empathy for others. Without these elements, a man may be physically capable of defending those around him, but emotionally, he may be distant and disconnected. A mother who spent her son's childhood abusing him, driven by her own anger and fear for losing control, cannot reasonably expect him to grow into a man who feels a deep intrinsic duty to protect her or anyone else. The lessons he learned in such an environment were not centered around empathy, care, or emotional connection, but rather survival and emotional detachment. As a result, the emotional foundation for genuine protection, a foundation rooted in love, was never built. Protection at its core is about emotional investment. It comes from the desire to shield someone from harm because you genuinely care for their well being. If a boy was raised in an environment where he was treated as a tool to be controlled rather than a human being to be nurtured, it becomes unrealistic to expect him to offer love and protection in return. How can a man who has never how can a man who has never experienced genuine emotional connection feel compelled to offer it to others? Without these performative experiences of care, the emotional capacity to protect those closest to him is stunted. The expectation that Black men raised in emotionally harsh and fear driven environments should instinctively assume the role of protector is unrealistic without first addressing the emotional damage caused by years of trauma. For Black men to truly fulfill the role of protector, they must first heal and reconnect with their own emotions, allowing empathy, care, and understanding to replace the patterns of detachment and suppression. Only by healing can these men genuinely rise to the challenge of being protectors, not just in a physical sense, but also in an emotionally connected and compassionate way. For many Black men, their earliest and most consistent experiences of violence came not from police or peers, but from their own mothers. This dynamic is often overlooked in conversations about emotional struggles Black men face, especially in their relationships with Black women. The harsh realities of growing up in environments where physical punishment and emotional suppression were commonplace can have profound effects on how a Black man perceives his own identity, as well as his relationship with the women in his life. For many Black men, love from their mothers was often expressed through harsh discipline, emotional neglect, or the projection of unresolved trauma from their own childhoods. The deep scars left by these experiences create complex emotional responses that persist long into adulthood. If the first memories of Black womanhood are tied to physical or emotional pain, the emotional attachment to Black women can become fraught with fear, confusion, and mistrust. This is not to suggest that mothers are inherently harmful, but rather that the cumulative weight of generational trauma can manifest in ways that affect the most important relationships. The dominant narrative within the Black community often centers around the idea that Black men fail to protect Black women, but it is crucial to acknowledge the other side of this dynamic. While there is undeniable truth in the accusations of neglect and harm toward Black women, what is often missing from this conversation is a deeper, more painful question. How did Black men arrive at a place where they feel emotionally detached from the women they are expected to cherish and protect? The lack of emotional connection may not stem from an inherent disregard for Black women, but from their earliest and most formative experiences, which have been distorted by violence, emotional disconnection, and trauma. The harsh reality is that if a man's earliest understanding of Black womanhood is shaped by experiences of violence and emotional suppression, he may struggle to develop an instinctive sense of protection or emotional connection towards Black women. He may grow up seeing Black womanhood through a lens of fear and resistance rather than compassion and love. How can a boy who was beaten, ridiculed, or emotionally stunted by the women who should have nurtured him learn to internalize a healthy, protective relationship with Black women? This disconnect often leads to an inability to connect deeply with Black women later in life, even though these same men may desire emotional connection and intimacy. This reality is not an excuse, it's not an attempt to rationalize harmful behavior. Rather, it is a painful reckoning with a hidden truth. Many Black men feel disconnected from Black women because their first experiences with them were rooted in fear, violence, and emotional neglect. The emotional wounds that result from these early experiences complicate their ability to form healthy relationships, leading to feelings of disconnection, emotional withdrawal, and lack of trust. Acknowledging this truth is not about absolving responsibility, but beginning the difficult work of healing and reconciling these complex dynamics. Only through understanding the origins of this emotional detachment can Black men begin the process of healing, reawakening their capacity for love, empathy, and true protection for Black women. The cycle of emotional abandonment manifests in a generation of Black men who have been systematically deprived of the love and nurturing they need to thrive. Because they were not given the love in their formative years, they struggle to offer it later in life. They have not been shown how to nurture as they themselves were not nurtured, and they lack the capacity to protect not from a personal failing, but because no one ever truly protected them when they were most vulnerable. This emotional void is not merely a personal shortcoming. It is the product of intergenerational trauma, systemic neglect, and cultural forces that devalue vulnerability. Society, through both overt and subtle messages, teaches these men to suppress their feelings and to rely on survival mechanisms rather than genuine emotional connection. This leaves them ill equipped to form deep, trusting relationships, leaving a trail of isolation and pain in their wake. Yet, even as these men struggle with emotional unavailability, There remains an expectation within the community, especially from Black women, burdened with their own histories of pain and loss, that these men should serve as steadfast protectors. They are expected to provide what they never received: unwavering support, love, and protection. This expectation creates a profound disconnect. It demands that Black men perform a role for which they have never been prepared, reinforcing a cycle where the absence of nurturing becomes a self perpetuating curse. Breaking the cycle requires a collective reckoning with the systemic forces that have fostered emotional abandonment. It means challenging the cultural narratives that prize stoicism over sensitivity and strength over vulnerability. Healing can only begin when both individuals and communities create spaces that encourage the expression of the full spectrum of human emotion, where asking for help is not seen as a weakness, but it's a necessary step towards wholeness. This expectation often leads to profound resentment. A man who was beaten into submission by his mother does not see her as a nurturing, guardian, and need of protection, but as the primary source of his early trauma. His formative years, marked by pain and coercion, leave him grappling with an enduring mistrust, an emotional burden that continues to affect his interactions and relationship well into adulthood. When a mother demands unwavering love and loyalty from a son she never truly nurtured, she imposes an impossible burden. She expects him to undo years of emotional conditioning, to heal wounds inflicted during his most vulnerable moments, wounds that continue to shape his perception of love, care, and protection. This contradictory expectation defies natural emotional development and perpetuates a cycle of emotional conflict. The son is left to reconcile a painful paradox. The very person who caused his suffering is now seen as the one he must care for and protect. For some men, the weight of this contradiction becomes unbearable. Unable to reconcile the need for maternal affection with the overwhelming sting of early suffering, they choose to distance themselves. In doing so, they embark on a difficult journey of self healing, a process that requires them to challenge and dismantle long held beliefs about familiar love and protection. This act of walking away, though painful, is often a crucial step toward reclaiming their identity and creating healthier, more balanced relationships in the future. For some Black men, this resentment may manifest in choosing partners outside of their community. Some, some may prefer to date white women, seeking relationships that feel detached from the trauma of their past and the expectations placed upon them. Others may prefer the company of other men, seeking emotional understanding and connection that they feel is absent in relationships with women. These preferences are not simply about attraction, but also about the desire to break free from the painful cycle of expectation and emotional entanglement with women who raised them. Ultimately, these choices reflect the deep emotional work that both Black women and the wider community must undertake to heal, rebuild trust, and foster connections that transcend the trauma of the past. It is a collective journey toward healing where everyone must play a part in breaking the cycle and creating a healthier, more supportive environment for all. Masculine traits such as strength, leadership, and independence, excuse me, masculine traits such as strength, leadership, and independence and resilience are essential in society. They provide structure, protection, and direction, enabling individuals to take on roles that require decisiveness, action, and responsibility. Masculinity allows people to navigate challenges, build stability, and assume leadership positions in both the public and private spheres. It also supports the creation and maintenance of systems that ensure collective well being. Without masculinity, society would lack the capacity to provide the necessary structure and stability to thrive. However, Black men's healing requires more than simply embracing masculinity. It also involves reclaiming the aspects of themselves that have been stolen or suppressed since childhood, particularly their connection to femininity. Self-actualization, the process of realizing and fulfilling one's true potential, demands balance and harmony within oneself. Masculinity offers structure, purpose, and direction, but it is femininity that nurtures the soul. Feminine qualities, empathy, compassion, vulnerability, creativity, and emotional intelligence offer emotional depth and connection, essential for becoming a whole and complete human being. A man who rejects or suppresses his feminine qualities denies himself a vital part of his humanity. By doing so, he limits his emotional range, stunts his personal growth, and cuts himself off from the very meaningful relationships he needs to heal. For Black men, the struggle to reconcile these two aspects of their identity often comes from being taught to reject femininity as weakness. They are raised in environments that place pressure on them to embody hypermasculinity, a version of manhood that is rigid and emotionally shallow. This version of manhood, often imposed by societal expectations, reduces men to one dimensional stereotypes of strength, dominance, and stoicism. Hypermasculinity is built on repression and emotional avoidance, pushing Black men to suppress their feelings, their softness, and their vulnerability, when these are qualities that are essential for growth and connection. As a result, many Black men struggle to be emotionally present with others. They are unable to show up for their partners, unable to connect with their children, and are emotionally distant from their communities. This is not a result of a lack of love or care, but because they have not been nurtured themselves and therefore do not know how to nurture others. True healing for Black men comes when they reclaim both their masculine and feminine sides, restoring balance and wholeness within themselves to truly thrive. Black men must embrace the full spectrum of their identity and allow room for their feminine traits. It is only in this balance that they can find their emotional strength and a deeper sense of purpose, which are essential for self love and healthy relationships. The issue with many Black men's relationship with Black women lies in the misguided expectation that women will fulfill the emotional void that comes from their lack of feminine self integration. Black men, having been deprived of nurturing in their early years, often look to Black women to complete them. This places an unfair burden on women who are expected to provide the emotional depth and healing that men find themselves, that the men themselves must first cultivate. It is essential that Black men understand that a woman cannot complete them. No person should rely on another to provide qualities that they are missing within themselves. A man must first be whole in his own, integrating both masculine and feminine qualities within himself before seeking a partnership. True partnership arises from two individuals who are complete and whole in their own identities, bringing their full range of strengths, emotional intelligence, and nurturing qualities into the relationship equally. When both individuals have done the work for self actualization, embracing both their masculinity and femininity, they create the foundation for a truly healthy and balanced relationship. For Black men, healing requires the recognition that they must embrace and integrate both masculine and feminine aspects of themselves, not only to enrich their own lives, but also to build strong, meaningful connections with others. Only through this reclamation of self can Black men thrive and move forward into a future of emotional fulfillment and relational health. Healing the mother's womb demands honest, unflinching, healing the mother's womb demands honest, unflinching conversation, one that transcends blame to acknowledge the complex systems that have broken so many Black mothers. These women are not inherently cruel or abusive, rather, they are often the products of a society designed to marginalize and overwhelm them, force them to raise children under conditions of relentless stress and vulnerability. However, understanding the origins of this pain does not erase its lasting impact. Many of these mothers were themselves abused in their own childhoods, a trauma that was never fully addressed. Instead, they find themselves projecting that unhealed pain onto their own children. Black mothers must confront the reality that their unresolved trauma and deep seated fears can drive harmful parenting practices. This is not about casting them as villains. It's a necessary step towards breaking generational cycles of pain. Accountability means recognizing that the violence inflicted on black boys is not an act of love. It is an exertion of control rooted in fear. Beating a child in an attempt to strip away perceived vulnerabilities does not build strength. It leaves lasting scars. Research demonstrates that physical punishment aimed at controlling gender expression creates profound psychological trauma that often manifests in adulthood as depression, anxiety, and difficulty forming healthy relationships. To begin healing, Black mothers need to ask themselves difficult questions. They must reflect on why their son's natural femininity unsettles them and consider whose approval they're desperately seeking by suppressing his true self. Additionally, they should examine what lingering pain from their own past they may be unconsciously projecting onto him. A key component of this healing process is humility. Black mothers must humble themselves and accept that they do not have all the answers. True growth comes from letting go of defensiveness and adopting an approach that prioritizes accountability, learning, and guidance over dominance and control. Only by acknowledging their own limitations and addressing their past trauma can they begin to mend the wounds of the past and pave the way for healthier, more compassionate futures for their children. Reclaiming the anima is about recognizing and honoring the qualities such as compassion, sensitivity, and nurturance, traits that are often dismissed or devalued in a world that prioritizes traditional masculine ideals. These qualities are often seen as signs of weakness, but in reality, they are sources of profound emotional strength and resilience. Far from being contrary to strength, these aspects of the anima deepen a person's capacity for empathy, understanding, and connection to others. Embracing the anima allows Black men to tap into emotional resources that foster not just personal healing, but also collective growth and unity. By reclaiming the anima, Black men have the opportunity to move beyond these limiting and often destructive norms. They can reclaim the full spectrum of their identity, where strength and vulnerability coexist, where leadership is balanced with emotional intelligence, where authenticity is prioritized over societal expectations. This journey towards self actualization is not about rejecting masculinity, but about expanding its definition, allowing for the richness and complexity that come with embracing both the masculine and feminine aspects of being human. In doing so, Black men can access a deeper sense of self, healing from the wounds inflicted from a society that has long tried to define them in narrow terms. Authentic strength is revealed through the ability to experience and express a full spectrum of emotion. A full spectrum of emotion. Excuse me, y'all. 1 second. True emotional expression isn't about conforming to societal expectations or performing a specific type of masculinity. It's about being fully human, embracing both masculine and feminine qualities. When Black men allow themselves to feel, to show vulnerability, to express joy, sadness, anger, and tenderness without fear of judgment, they break free from the externally imposed mandate of stoicism that has often defined their emotional landscape. This openness to emotion is a crucial step toward healing as it allows for deeper connections with others. It is only through genuine emotional expression can men truly connect with their partners, families, and communities on a human level, moving towards surface level interactions and into authentic relationships built on mutual understanding and empathy. The belief that emotions should be suppressed or hidden become because they are seen as weakness creates a barrier to genuine emotional intimacy and isolates individuals. Furthermore, emotional expression is also is about doing what feels natural and authentic to oneself rather than worrying about how others will perceive it. Black men must learn to trust their own emotional experiences and not be bound by unrealistic standards of external emotional suppression imposed by society. The need to appear tough or stoic at all costs often prevents the emotional depth required for true growth and healing when Black men no longer care about conforming to these emotional. Y'all, I'm sorry. I have so. I'm going to get through this, but I have so much mucus that just keeps coming up. hopefully my sinus surgery will help to alleviate this. When black men no longer care about conforming to these external pressures, they reclaim the freedom to be their true selves, free from judgment, free from societal norms, and free to feel deeply by embracing emotional suppression. Black men not only create space for their own healing, but they also pave the way for healthy relationships with others. It is in this embrace of full emotional range that they can dismantle the walls that have kept them isolated and begin to form more authentic, meaningful connections. Healing is rooted in the ability to feel and share those feelings with others unburdened by fear of judgment or rejection. It is only by doing so that black men can live lives that are emotionally fulfilled, connected, and in line with their true selves. Am I almost done? This is a long ass chapter. I don't know if I want to go through all of this. The narrow definition of masculinity that have often been imposed on black men are not a reflection of personal shortcomings, but are instead the result of external pressures and distorted cultural ideals. These rigid expectations often limit the emotional and psychological growth of black men, shaping them into one-dimensional figures that cannot fully express themselves or realize their true potential. The idea that black men must conform to these restrictive definitions is not a result of any inherent flaw, but rather a cultural and societal imposition that has been passed down through generations. Is a distorted view that undermines their humanity by stripping away the richness of their emotional and spiritual lives. Embracing the anima or the inner feminine is an act of self compassion, a way for black men to recognize that the pressures to perform a specific kind of masculinity is not their fault. Healing begins when they understand that this expectation, this distortion of who they are meant to be was never inherent to them. These cultural pressures were not organically a part of their identities. They were external forces that imposed limitations on what it means to be human. By confronting this truth, black men can begin to heal and reclaim the parts of themselves that were neglected, suppressed, or even demonized over time. When black men choose to embrace their inner feminine, excuse me, I need to get through this chapter. Qualities such as compassion, sensitivity, emotional intelligence, and vulnerability. They affirm that this is not a sign of weakness, but rather a powerful step towards authenticity and wholeness. I'm going to skip some of this. The rejection of femininity is not solely a personal shortcoming. It is a collective issue that resonates throughout the black community. This rejection is deeply entwined with long-held cultural narratives that devalue the nurturing, sensitive, and empathetic aspects of our identity. For generations, harmful ideas have been passed down that equate strength solely with a hardened, aggressive form of masculinity, while dismissing the equally vital qualities of compassion and tenderness as a sign of weakness. This collective challenge calls on the black community to confront its complicity in perpetuating gendered violence. It means critically examining and rejecting the belief that masculinity inherently equals strength and that femininity automatically equates to weakness. True power lies not in rigid gender roles, but in a balanced integration of both masculine and feminine energies, a balance that nurtures authentic human connection and resilience. Accountability is also crucial. The community must hold parents responsible for abusive discipline practices, even when such methods have become normalized as a misguided form of protection. It is imperative to recognize that these practices, often justified as a necessary preparation for a hostile world, inflict long lasting harm on our children. Abusive discipline, regardless of its purported intent, perpetuates cycles of trauma that extend far beyond individual families. Moreover, we must confront the broader systemic forces at play. Capitalism and white supremacy have long shaped parenting practices in ways that dehumanize Black children, reducing them to instruments of survival rather than recognizing them as individuals with intrinsic worth. These external pressures have encouraged a brutal approach to discipline that views Black children as soldiers to be hardened for relentless battle rather than as human beings deserving of love, dignity, and the freedom to explore their full selves. Ultimately, the call is clear. Black children are not property, nor are they tools to be molded solely for survival. They are human beings worthy of nurturing, respect, and the opportunity to grow into their complete selves. Embracing this truth requires a collective transformation, one that challenges harmful cultural norms and prioritizes genuine care over punitive measures. The mother's womb is not inevitable. It is not an inescapable part of Black childhood. It is a cycle that can and must be broken. Black mothers must recognize that true love is not control, it is not domination, it is not the suppression of femininity for the sake of survival. True love is nurturing, it is a protection through guidance, not fear. It is creating a home where a child can cry without punishment, express joy without ridicule, and explore identity without shame. Black fathers too have a role to play. They must step up, not just as providers, but as protectors. It is their duty to shield their sons from maternal violence, to advocate for nurturing parenting practices, and to model healthy masculinity that embraces vulnerability. And Black boys, those who survive but never thrive, must reclaim the parts of themselves that were stolen. Healing is possible, but it requires courage, the courage to embrace femininity, to confront internalized shame, and to build relationships rooted in authenticity rather than fear. The cycle ends when Black mothers stop using their sons as emotional punching bags. It ends when Black fathers refuse to be silent bystanders. It ends when the community values nurturing over discipline, love over control, and humanity over survival. True motherhood is not domination. True fatherhood is not detachment. True masculinity is not repression. It is time to break the cycle, to heal the mother's womb, to create a new path where Black boys can grow into whole, self actualized men, free to embrace every part of themselves without fear. Only then will the promise of liberation be fully realized, not just for Black men, but for the entire Black community. Now, I've already gone through chapter 4, so I'm not going to go through that. But chapter 4, I've already explained the negative impact that absentee Black fathers have on the childhood development of their sons. So, for those who think that I'm taking a side, no, I have critiqued the fathers and the mothers equally. Let me see if I have any comments. I don't. All right, y'all. So that is my reading of chapter 3. Hopefully, I can get through 2 more chapters before the end of um before the end of this month for Pride Month. So I don't know. I do want to talk about the history and how we got to where we are and why we should be Pride, why we should actually celebrate Pride. So y'all, this bear with me and hopefully I'll be able to get to it. So I appreciate everybody's support. Y'all have a good day.